Welcome back to another discussion on the Lost and Forgotten, where we are in discussion with Dr. Zameer Careem, a historian attached to the University of Colombo. We are in fact discussing about the Afghans who settled in Ceylon for a very long time. Dr. Careem, I think to start off the third episode of our series, The Lost and Forgotten, let me ask you, what was the culture of the Afghans like soon after they settled here in Sri Lanka?
Their culture was very different to that of the rest of the Sri Lankan population, because though people presume that only the Afghan men came to the country, no, the Afghan also brought their women folk. So there was a proper Afghan community living in Sri Lanka, in Slave Island and in Kandy and various other places of our country. So the Afghan culture, as I mentioned, was very exotic to the Sri Lankans because they had their own celebrations, they had their own cuisine, they had their own traditional clothes, and their languages were very different to that of the Sri Lankans, because the Afghans spoke Pashto. They spoke Dari, which is a variant of the Iranian Persian that is spoken in Afghanistan, as well as they spoke Baluchi. And then they were also proficient in the Sri Lankan languages, such as Sinhala, Tamil, Bahasa Malay, which is Sri Lankan Malay.
They had to deal with Sri Lankans on a daily basis.
Yes, because they were involved in money lending and usury, as I mentioned. So in order to interact with the Sri Lankans, especially with the Welshers, they had to kind of know the language. So their languages are different. Likewise, their cuisine was very different, because the Afghans, unlike the Sri Lankans, were known for their meat dishes, a wide array of meat dishes like the kebab, the Kabuli pulao, and all those wide array of meat dishes like salads and vegetarian dishes. And unlike the Sri Lankan cuisine, the Afghan cuisine is a bit different because they employ a lot of unsweetened yogurt. So when we cook, we use a lot of unsweetened yogurt, a lot of tomatoes, a lot of nuts. And so almonds, peanuts, ground nuts, we employ a lot of nuts in terms of the cooking, and the cuisine is very different, and we have various dishes.
But in fact, an interesting fact that seems to be coming out is that there are several cuisines that are still being practiced in Sri Lanka as well.
Yes, like for example, you have the kebab and the pulao, they are very popular among the Sri Lankans. Likewise, the tantalizing delicacies like the sherbet and the faluda, because sherbet comes from Persia.
The Afghans.
You can't really say whether it was the Afghans who introduced, because there were Afghans, there were Parsis, there were Boras, Khojas, Maimans. All these communities came from North India. But because sherbet is actually a Persian word, it's a Persian word, so the drink was in fact very popular among the Persians. And there was also another drink called ayran, which is lassi. Right. So yogurt mixed with water, and then you add mint. So very popular among the Afghans. So it can be surmised with tolerable authority, because the Afghans settled in our country prior to the advent of the Boras and the Maimans. So they could have introduced all these delicacies to Ceylon, like the sherbet and the faluda. And there was something called shiryak, which is shir means milk in Pashto. So it's like kulfi, it's ice cream. Back then, the Afghans introduced all these other delicacies to our country.
Speaking about the celebrations of the Afghans here in Sri Lanka, what were the celebrations like? Did they have any particular festivities that they used to take part in?
As Muslims, because a majority of Afghans who settled in Sri Lanka were Sunnis, they followed the Hanafi jurisprudence. So they had their own mosque, the Hanafi mosque down Castle Street, Kandy, and then there was a mosque in Slave Island as well. And they were Sunnis, but
so are these mosques still here in?
The Hanafi mosque at Castle Street is still there. It was built upon the contributions made by the Afghans as well as the Moors. And the Afghans who settled in Ceylon were also Sufis. They were believers of Islamic mysticism. So their way of worship involves chanting, poetry, music, dancing, very different to that of the rest of the population, and they believed in sainthood. So the Afghans celebrated the Muslim festivities just as their counterparts, but they also celebrated something called Nowruz. Nowruz is the Persian New Year. That is the first day of spring. So it's celebrated between the 19th and the 21st of March. So Nowruz is celebrated only by two communities of Sri Lanka. One is the Afghan community, and the other being the Parsis. So the Parsis are the Zoroastrians who came and settled in Ceylon during the colonial period. Their ancestry can be traced to Persia. So the Nowruz celebration was very popular among the Afghans back then. They used to celebrate on the God Face Esplanade. That's where they had their festivities. So they have their Attan, which is the Pashto Afghan dancing. Okay, so it's called Attan. Then Pavlovani is wrestling, Buzkashi is goat pulling, and they also had their other celebrations and another sport known as the egg packing or egg tapping. Basically, you have hard-boiled eggs, so you crack them against each other, and if your egg cracks, you lose.
All right.
Yeah,
all right.
it sounds hideous, but this is a very popular game among the Afghans. Likewise, they had other sports like drafts, which is dam. So the Afghans had their sporting events and stuff.
So were these introduced by the Afghans in Sri Lanka,
Yeah, because
or
no other community had all these festivities, because it's only the Afghans, and there were a few Shia Afghans as well. So those Shia Afghans used to have their Hobson Jobson festival, as it was
What
known,
about it?
because the British couldn't pronounce Hassan Hussein. So because of that reason, they used fire walking was very common back then. Just like the Hindus, fire walking and piercing and lamenting and all those things were very different to that of the celebrations that you're familiar with. But the Afghans used to take part in all these celebrations back then, and these events have also been recorded by the police officers of our country. If you read the history of Ceylon police, you'll read about various celebrations in Colombo
you were
and in
also
Kandy.
talking about the dresses that were worn by the Afghans when they came down to Sri Lanka. What were the dresses that were wearing?
The men and women both wore shalwar kameez. They had this distinctive garb. Now, when we talk about shalwar kameez in Sri Lanka, many presume that it's only a garment worn by women. No. In Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, in various parts of India, shalwar kameez worn by both men and
So
women.
is it similar to the shalwar that is worn nowadays?
Yeah, because
by-
shalwar means it's a trouser that you wear. Kameez is the upper garment. So whether it be the shalwar, the kate, the prahan, the partug, there are various traditional dresses that were worn by the Afghans in the country, and the Afghan men wore velvet or a silk jacket, and their trousers were very different because they were heavily pleated trousers, wide at the waist, narrow at the ankles, and then they wore their turbans. Their heads were swathed in exotic turbans, and upon their feet they wore military boots, and they also wore cummerbunds. Cummerbunds are like silk waistbands that the English gentlemen wear, but the term cummerbund comes from Hindi kamarband. It was very popular among
What
the
does
Indians.
it stand for?
Kamarband is basically a band that you wrap around your waist, and in it you carry like the grooming kit, the beetle paraphernalia, and the Afghans also carried their daggers, not just the men but also the women.
Right here in Sri Lanka.
In Sri Lanka, it's called peshkabs. So you carry your dagger, your beetle paraphernalia, your grooming kit, and all those things in the kamarband, which is in fact an English word which originated in Hindi.
So was this dress common to all Afghans in Sri Lanka, or was it concentrated onto one particular class of the community?
The Afghans were again subdivided into various tribes. You had the Afridi tribe, the Durrani tribe, the Yusufzai, Ahmadzai, Khilji, Qurani, Durrani, various tribes, sub-tribes, and they spoke different dialects. And most of the Pashtuns lived in some places known as Havelis or Chameris. So they had their homes in Slave Island, Union Place and stuff. But Q Road in particular housed the Baluchis. Okay, so there are a few differences in terms of the clothing when you compare the Baluchis and the Pashtuns. And some of the Pashtuns wore a cap known as kulla, and around the cap they used to wrap their turbans. And when you read the British accounts, you will find things like they used to carry with them a truncheon to whack their debtors, their swindling debtors. And there are stories as such, but I have not really met or spoken to an Afghan descendant who has mentioned of their ancestor carrying a truncheon. But most of the Afghans used to wear the clothes that I mentioned.
So you were also referring to several wonderful celebrations and cultures that have been brought into this country. But before that, before we dive deep into that, you also spoke about males and females from Afghanistan coming down to Sri Lanka. Let's speak about the marriages. Were marriages taking place strictly within the Afghan community, or did you see marriages taking place between communities that already existed in Sri Lanka?
Okay, so the Afghans were not really an endogamous community in Sri Lanka. So you had Afghans who had brought their women folk from Afghanistan, and those who did not bring their women folk married women from other communities. They married Moors, they married Malays, they married Singhalese, they married Tamils. They didn't really mind whom they're getting married to. And some of the Afghans shared their own cultural mores and assimilated well into the other communities, right? And thereby the descendants became part of the mother's community and not part of the father's community, the Afghan community. Likewise, even the patroness saint of the Wakanda Mosque in Slave Island is an Afghan woman, Osan Bibi. So it was an Afghan lady who died, and she was buried there, and she was revered as a saint by the Muslims of our country. So marriages were very common. The Afghans have never maintained this endogamy, and they have never stopped their relatives from marrying outside of the community. It's very common among the
So
Afghans.
speaking about the celebrations, the cultures and these wonderful games that were practiced here in Sri Lanka, where are they right now?
Okay, so what
went
happened
wrong
was
down the line?
So what happened was, in the early years of the 20th century, in 1918, there was this money lending ordinance that was passed by the British government, because, as I mentioned, the British were keen on getting rid of the Afghans because of the fact that they were anti-imperialist, they were against the British colonial rule, they were explicit about it. So the British used the 1915 Sinhala Muslim pogrom as a reason, as an excuse to get rid of the Afghans. And then in 1918, because money lending was rife, because all the civil servants, in fact, according to KPS Menon, who was India's first foreign secretary, and he was the agent of the government of India in Ceylon, and according to his autobiography, an unexpurgated autobiography of his, he mentions that the entire railway officialdom were indebted to the Afghans. Civil servants, even white-collar workers, labourers, fisherfolk were all indebted to the Afghans and the Chettis because they were moneylenders. And because of that reason, the British wanted to get rid of the Afghans. So they passed the money lending ordinance in 1918, which presumed that every Afghan in the country was a moneylender, which isn't true, because there were Afghans who were involved in various other professions.
As well.
So there were only a few Afghans who were involved in money lending. And then the 1918 ordinance came about, and their money lending business was curtailed as a result of it. Then came in 1931, the State Mortgage Bank was instituted. Then 1932, the Income Tax Ordinance came about. And then 1938 and 39, there was this Bank of Ceylon, which was established in 1939. And then the Estate Duty Ordinance and various other stuff came about. The establishment of state enterprises, the government regulations, and the law enactments prevented the Afghans from engaging in money lending and pawnbroking. So this resulted in all those money lenders moving to the highlands because they couldn't operate under these strictures in the major cities of our country. So they moved to the highlands and they continued their business unfitted by this. But then came in 1948, when Ceylon gained independence, then came the Ceylon Citizenship Act. So according to the Ceylon Citizenship Act, only the third generation immigrants were granted citizenship. And then you should have the necessary documents to prove that you were born and raised in Ceylon. Unfortunately, the illiterate Afghans did not possess the necessary documents to prove that they were born and raised, because they never registered the births of their children or the deaths of their individuals. They had no documents to prove that they have been living in this country for generations. So a majority of Afghans who were living in the country were made stateless. Then in 1949 came the India-Pakistan Repatriation Act. And this made most of the Afghans who were stateless, and they were forced to repatriate. They were forced to leave the country. So majority of the Afghans left. Then in 1963 came the Finance Act, which prevented any foreigner from indulging in money lending and pawnbroking in the country. So except for those who had married Sri Lankans, the rest of the Afghans who were living in the country, because they did not have the necessary documents. Since 1946, any of Sri Lanka's demographic statistics or enumeration hasn't mentioned Afghan. So the Afghan community, no one really knows what happened to the community.
So basically it is considered to be a community that is extinct, no more in
extinct in the sense the full-blooded Afghans have gone extinct. But Sri Lanka is still home to people of mixed race. Afghans
I'm sure that you're a perfect example, since your roots go back all the way to Afghanistan.
Yeah, so my great-grandfather Careem Ghanibai Khan he was a Pashtun who settled in the country in the 1880s. He was a coachman. Just like how the Afghans were brought as horsekeepers, he was a coachman who came to Ceylon and he settled in the country, and I'm the fourth generation descendant. The reason being that there is a huge generation gap, because my grandfather was 40 years when he got married and my great-grandfather was old as well. So this intermarriages and marrying outside of the community has never been frowned upon by the Afghans. We have in fact encouraged assimilating ourselves into the larger ethnic groups. But what I would encourage for the youngsters is to preserve the heritage, values, ethos, customs of your forebears, and prevent these cultures from going extinct. And that is the only piece of advice.
Definitely, that's what makes this country even more special, given
diversity
the
is our strength.
diversity.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Careem, for being a part of our show, where we discussed about several facts surrounding the Afghans who settled here in Sri Lanka, and also explored their contributions to this wonderful nation. After all, it is unity amongst diversity that makes us as Sri Lankans special. Thank you very much for all our viewers for joining us on The Lost and Forgotten. We will be back with a brand new series of episodes on the Malays who came down here to Sri Lanka. Until next time, have yourselves a great day ahead. Take care and God bless.